This is Christ's church. Christ is the one who is building this church. Christ ultimately is the one who is shepherding these people's souls. At best, I can function as an under-shepherd. And so the actual authority that has been delegated to me is relatively small. And the more we can acknowledge that and grow in our own comfort of that and understand that God's love for us, affection toward us, does not at all in any way, shape, or form hinge on our capacity to compel good moral behavior from other people, right? Like the more we can just like let go of those expectations that sometimes people tend to put on us, the healthier we can be as leaders. And I would even use that language within the church, leading not in the sense of telling others what to do, but leading and working to continually try to model as best we can a healthy inner spirituality that manifests itself in not needing to control those around us.
Hey everyone, welcome back to That Jesus Podcast. I'm here once again without Titus, who, as this is recording is happening, is still recording still wandering around on the subcontinent of India. Looking forward to him coming back. And I'm joined tonight by our longtime guest, panelist, host, whatever, Rebekah Mui. Good to have you on board, ma'am.
Hey.
How's life in the archipelago? You're not in the archipelago. You're in the peninsula.
What is it? Yes. Yeah, it's great. We just had almost a first anniversary of the Kingdom Outpost. It was started on March 1 last year. Check out kingdomoutpost.org.
Always on brand, never disappoints. And we're also joined tonight by a little closer to home, Jon Carlson over there in Pennsylvania. How's it going in the Keystone State?
Hey, it's great to be here. It's finally starting to feel a little bit like spring when we're recording this. We had snow on the ground over the weekend, and now we're up in the 70s, so I'll take it.
Okay, Jon, I'm sorry we can't have that happening. Titus isn't here, but he left strict orders not to talk about weather.
Not to talk about weather. You asked me how it was going in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, I know.
All right.
Is Pennsylvania a state?
It is a commonwealth.
It is a commonwealth. That's what I thought.
Pennsylvania and Virginia, the only two, to my knowledge, yeah.
Delaware?
Delaware's the first state.
Oh, okay.
So they're not going to give that one up easily. But yeah, Massachusetts might still be a commonwealth, but definitely Pennsylvania and Virginia. I do not know the difference between the two.
Okay. Yeah, well, we're here not to talk about commonwealths or weather or the Kingdom Outpost, although Rebekah, feel free to plug throughout. We're talking about something else that's maybe going to make our listeners a bit cringy. And Rebekah and I were talking about doing this. I already had it in mind. She brought it up. We're going to talk about church and abuse and the abuse of power. And yes, this came about kind of thinking about the fallout around Bruxy Cavey and his church up in Canada and the allegations of abuse that he acknowledged sexual sin. And that's going to be part of what we talk about actually, and abuse of power. And it's a little bit, it feels a little bit icky to me even to be springboarding off of something so icky to make a podcast. And yet it's what we're thinking about. So I don't want this to sound too hot take-ish. I don't want this to sound too opportunistic, but it's a real thing. And so with that said, I also want to note that we will be talking some about sexual abuse and about spiritual abuse, and consider this a bit of a trigger warning. Make sure you're listening to it when you're in a healthy mental space. And if you're not sure you can be there, then wait till the next one where we talk about entertainment. So, Jon, let me see if I have this right. You are a pastor of a mainstream Mennonite mega church in Lancaster.
Everything except the mega is correct there. We've never come close to 1,000 attendees on a single weekend. Our attendance hovers somewhere around 200, 220 pre-pandemic. I don't know what we are at this point in time, which is, relatively large by even mainstream Mennonite standards. Yeah.
Yeah, and definitely by Northern Wisconsin Anabaptist standards.
Sure.
And how long have you been in that role as a pastor there?
Yeah, it's going to be 8 years in May. I started in May of 2014, so coming up on 8 years. But again, pandemic time is different, so I'm actually coming up on my 20th year serving this church.
Yes, I understand. And you're also the, help me with the lingo here. You're the moderator of your church conference.
Moderator-elect for Mennonite Church USA. So Mennonite Church
So that means
USA,
you're
or
Mennonite Calvinist, or
no, the elect is yeah. I hadn't quite put that together with Calvin before, even though I've been bandying this term about for a long, long time. So thanks for planting that little earworm in my head. That's going to stick.
Welcome.
I really appreciate that. It was predestined to be.
It was
I suppose. Yeah. What can we do? No, moderator-elect is it's sort of a preparatory term. So there's a moderator of the church who serves a 2-year term, and a moderator-elect who serves a 2-year term. And then at the end of those, the moderator steps down, the moderator-elect becomes moderator, and then that cycle kind of continues. So it's an attempt to provide an amount of stability to leadership, that you have someone coming into a role who has some experience, has been at the table, involved in some of the conversations.
Okay. But you're, and I'm saying this kind of tongue in cheek, but also seeking to sort of understand how it works. You're the top dog, the head honcho, or you will be in a year.
Well, so, Mennonites have this ambivalence about power and authority, right? So in some ways, the moderator functions similarly to how the chairperson of a board in a corporation might function. But then we also would have compensated staff who, this role is a volunteer role, moderator-elect. Then we also would have an executive director, sort of drawing a little bit from sort of an NGO, nonprofit kind of a model. And what we say is that ultimately, the ultimate authority within the church is Jesus. And the voice of Jesus is best discerned within community. And so the highest human authority within the church is what we would call the delegate body, which is a representative group representing all the congregations that are part of Mennonite Church USA. And so the role of the moderator-elect, even the executive director to some extent, is to convene that group, to bring that group together, to establish an agenda, what they're going to talk about, how they're going to engage in their discernment, and then to seek to carry out the decisions that they feel God has led them to make during the times when they're not meeting together.
Okay, so you really are seeking to be kind of a bottom-up framework for church authority.
We are trying. I don't know that we always get it right. And as I'm sure, I think Rebekah might point to later on in our conversation, there's always been, I think from the very beginnings of the Anabaptist movement, this ambivalence or ambiguity, complexity around questions of leadership, power, and authority. And so there is a current in the Anabaptist tradition that really rejects any sort of hierarchy, really rejects any sort of top-down controlling kinds of behavior, that recognizes that Anabaptism emerged as a rejection of a very hierarchical system. But then relatively early on in the Anabaptist tradition, there's this sort of pragmatic concession that says, hey, wait a minute, it's really easy for people to not follow Jesus, you can put different language around this, to become worldly, or to reject the ordnung, or whatever language they would use. And so some parts of the Anabaptist movement really gravitate back toward a really tight kind of authority structure. And so you see this, and some Anabaptists in North America would think of that as normative, right? Where you have bishops and deacons and pastors who wield an awful lot of very direct power. And we have some of those tendencies in Mennonite Church USA too. So there's always this like push-pull. What does healthy leadership look like, and what does healthy community look like? And we're always trying to find our way through it, and not always getting it right.
So why do you have a conference? Why do you have a parachurch organizational structure if you're trying to get away from the pitfalls of that? Yeah.
It would depend who you ask, right? Like there would be, so again, pretty early on in the Anabaptist movement, individual local communities sent representatives to talk together with one another and to make some common agreements together. So this becomes the first confession of faith in the Anabaptist tradition, the Schleitheim Confession. And what I've heard some historians refer to that as is that Anabaptism from the outset is congregational authority modified by what they call a synodal element, right? There's a church synod very early on in the Anabaptist movement that says, we believe that we are called to be the people of God together. And it's hard to be the people of God together if it's just our small, isolated little community. And so that idea of communal decision-making beyond the congregation has pretty deep roots in the Anabaptist tradition. So that's part of it. You would have people who say the primary role of the larger structure, whether that would be like a regional structure like an area conference or a national structure like a denomination, the primary role is to actually enforce orthodoxy, right? Like to make sure that people believe and act in the right ways. There are very much people in Mennonite Church USA who think that way. I get a lot of emails from them, and it's super fun to have those conversations. There are others who say, no, we trust local decision-making. We trust local congregations to discern faithfulness in their own context. And the reason we come together is for ministry and mission and mutual encouragement, edification. And so it's things like being able to empower people to invest in church planning, being able to help people steward their financial resources, being able to do publishing efforts. Bruxy's publisher is part of Mennonite Church USA. Bruxy's published by Herald Press, which is an imprint of Menno Media, which is the denominational publishing arm. And so they've now pulled his titles. They're no longer going to be putting them in circulation. And but you know, that's a difficult example. But Mennonite Church USA is, to my knowledge, the smallest denomination that actually still has its own publishing arm. And so being able to produce material from a distinctively Anabaptist perspective is something that would be really hard for any one congregation to do. Even the Meeting House, right, massive, largest Anabaptist congregation in North America, they turn to Menno Media or Herald Press to publish that message. And so it's that sort of collaborative, the fact that we can do more together than we can in isolation, that provides for some people the rationale behind having a denomination.
And Rebekah, feel free to chime in with any questions or comments here too. Jon, not to put you too much on the spot, because I know in your position you're seeking to sort of represent or speak, maybe not speak for everybody, but to not disenfranchise anyone, right? Which side do you come down more on as being your vision for a parachurch structure? The side of like cooperation, or the side of accountability?
I think what I've recognized is that no one is super consistent in their answer to that question. And I would be the same way. And so in some ways it depends how passionately we feel about a particular question, a particular issue, a particular challenge. You see different aspects come out. So the very live conversation in Mennonite Church USA right now is around LGBTQ relationships and the appropriateness of LGBTQ relationships relative to the church and how the church responds. And so you've seen for a long time folks with what I would think of as more traditionalist views on those questions look to the denomination to be that centralized authority structure, to say, this is the teaching position, people need to follow this position and practice this faithfully. What you've started to see in the past few years is that folks with a more progressive understanding who see these as questions of injustice are also now starting to say, the denomination needs to enforce a particular view on these questions and ensure that people are in agreement with them. And so it's really hard to be consistent. So I would say that my natural personal inclination is that I believe in the local church, and I believe in local discernment. I believe in local communities getting together, wrestling things out, seeking God together, engaging Scripture together. That's where I see good things happening. That's my natural bias. But there are those specific cases where, because I feel personally so passionately about something, I'm like, wait, I want there to be a really strong accountability structure here. I think that way about the prevention of abuse, right? Like dealing with clergy misconduct. I want to see a really solid and even sometimes heavy-handed approach from the broader structures. Maybe heavy-handed is not quite the best word there. But I want to know that the broader structures take those questions seriously and will hold local congregations to account if they don't. I feel the same way about a commitment to nonviolence, right? Like I want to see a national body that has a deep and firm commitment to nonviolence, even recognizing that there might be some differences in how that plays out in local context. So by and large, my impulse, my instinct is toward the local congregation. But there are those specific instances where I find myself feeling more conflicted about that impulse.
And for the record, and I'm not even meaning for the record to assuage the uncomfortableness of some of our audience. We would probably skew more on saying Jesus designed marriage between one man and one woman.
Sure.
You would fall on that traditional view of God's design for sexual relationships being between a man and a woman, but you're also comfortable walking with people that would take a different position.
Sure. Yeah, that sums it up pretty nicely. Yeah.
And we might come back to that because I think that's for me, honestly, that's a little bit confusing. And I neither support every single thing that Jon says or Rebekah says, or definitely not everything that Titus says. This is a platform to share and to listen and to learn, even as we might disagree. And so maybe we can come back to that. How do you walk with people? For me, it feels like such a profoundly significant issue. And frankly, how do they walk with you, who would look at their lifestyle and say this is sin? But I think we should get some historical perspective that you've touched on already, Jon. Rebekah, what's the sort of historical Anabaptist approach? Are they more about just working together, pooling of resources, or is it about that maintaining that orthodoxy, that theological and practice accountability?
I found that statement about, like a top-down approach to, say, for example, clergy abuse, because, clergy abuse is within a kind of like a top-down framework. So is there, I guess I have a quick question for Pastor Jon. Is there a way that, dealing with abuse, taking it really seriously, can it be something that, is maybe comes from the parachurch organization, but also comes from the congregations and from...
Yeah, and it is that the specific challenge of clergy misconduct, clergy sexual abuse, really challenges Christian traditions with a stronger commitment to congregationalism than Anabaptists, right? So the prime example in North America right now is the Southern Baptist Convention. The Southern Baptist Convention wields no formal authority over their congregations, with one or two maybe exceptions, the primary one being women in leadership, right? So if a Southern Baptist congregation calls a woman to preach in a Sunday morning service, that congregation can be put out of the convention. Mm-hmm. If a Southern Baptist congregation hires a known sexual offender to serve as their pastor, up until very recently, the Southern Baptists had no formal mechanism for disciplining or correcting or addressing that congregation. So this is something that a lot of Christian traditions are having to figure out and find their way through. So I don't think that fully answers your question, but I think it maybe highlights the complexity of the question.
Yeah.
I wonder if I could just chime in, because we're still haven't really gotten to the history part in depth, but I wonder if rather than accountability or making sure people maintain orthodoxy, if a healthier way of thinking about some of the issues why we might need other churches is for courage. When you come to an issue that takes real courage, the local congregation might not have the capacity in themselves to make the courageous choice. They might not have the perspective to be able to see, and they call somebody else in to give them that courage. To totally rip verses out of context, I believe, help thou my unbelief. I know I need help. I know our body needs help, but we need somebody from the outside to give us that. And we need somebody out from the outside to stand with us in addressing issues of our day that we're not sure we can stand against.
So, obviously, I'm not a pastor or involved in any kind of church, even a church that like leadership or parachurch or anything like that. We're just like
we're
ecclesiastically just like really small. So there's I don't have that kind of exposure to a giant mega parachurch thing like Pastor Jon does. But more of it, I was just looking at this issue from a theological perspective before an ecclesiological perspective, as in from the perspective of nonviolence, reading about issues with abuse in the past, such as with John Howard Yoder and with many other leaders that were significant voices in nonviolent theology and that have For example, Bruxy KV, John Howard Yoder, of course, not the same thing, but people who have been known to preach nonviolence, and then it comes out that they have been committing acts of sexual abuse or, etc. So the question that I often have is, people often respond by saying, oh, the teaching is correct. Absolutely. It's just that the person didn't, live up to it, or their life, So there's no connection. But to me, I think there always has to be an examination of the idea, like what comes forth from the tree. If the fruit is bitter, then the tree itself also, there must be something we have to look at. I'm not saying that it is like whatever, but has to be looked at, I think. And one of the biggest issues with nonviolent theology for me is its sole focus on only male understandings or experiences of violence. To abstain from the sword, from magistracy, from military conscription, these were all primarily male experiences in 16th century Switzerland. And even today, it still revolves around, like, nonviolence is centered on these things and say these are the non-negotiables. And by all means, but why isn't it, in conversation, in theology, or in statements of faith, all other forms of violence are not included, such as racial violence or economic violence or domestic violence or sexual violence. These are outside of the realms of high politics. They're considered sort of low politics or social relations. I think that this has come about not intentionally, but because, like, certain voices are stronger and more amplified, and they shape what is central. And then these other things become peripheral, less important, or marginalized as a result.
Can I suggest that it's maybe, in some cases, it's actually a little worse than that? We focus on the theoretical, draft. Do I go to war or not? We focus on the theoretical, what if somebody breaks into my house? Because if I can check that box and call myself an Anabaptist, call myself non-resistant, call myself a lover of my enemies, then some of the more challenging aspects of the teaching of Jesus, like, not lording over each other and submitting to one another in love, and like what you talked about with domestic violence, which is rampant in many Anabaptist communities, we don't have to think about those because we've talked about the big things, the quote, things that really matter. I don't mean to say that it's intentional, but I think sometimes it's an easy way to just dismiss the realer things by engaging in the hypothetical.
It's almost like creedalism at this point, because nobody is actually in danger of the military draft. Yeah, so that's kind of my spiel. That's what I kind of noticed digging into it, that there must be, I think what, like, John Howard Yoder centered around, really dug into and focused into was perhaps missing something, or maybe reflected something that was missing, that we could perhaps talk more about, not just to add in, but really to say, this is central. Why is domestic violence not considered central to a nonviolent witness?
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah. Can one of the two of you talk just a little bit about John Howard Yoder? I don't want to do muckraking here, but I think some of our audience would have heard the name, even going to conservative Mennonite Bible institutes, they would have had John Howard Yoder quotes. But what's wrong with John Howard Yoder?
Yeah, so I'm going to quote someone here, a scholar by the name of Lisa Soul Cahill, who just very succinctly says, John Howard Yoder was a theological genius and an ecclesial prophet. He was a sexual abuser. This reality generates a quandary over how to transmit Yoder's legacy honestly. So Yoder is the most influential Anabaptist theologian
For sure.
To sort of bring Anabaptism into mainstream American academic theological discourse. So he's building on work of Harold Bender with the Anabaptist Vision and a little bit Guy Hirschberger. But really, Yoder is the one who says Anabaptists have a key theological claim that other Christian traditions lack. And he had the capacity, the insight, the intellect, the training, the education to engage at a very sophisticated theological level. And while he was doing that very sophisticated theological work, he was a serial predator of women and sexually assaulting women. And yeah, so that is the complexity of Yoder's legacy. And so when you think about contemporary advocates of nonviolence, particularly Stanley Hauerwas and all those who studied under him, Hauerwas would not be a pacifist if he hadn't had Yoder as a professor. Like there's a very direct connection between Yoder and contemporary, at least American, and to some extent global Christian nonviolence, Christian pacifism. And so Yoder's abuse poses a challenge for anyone today who claims to be a Christian pacifist.
And I'm just going to affirm, I'm not like a deep, read the dusty pages of theological textbooks or thousands of pages of PDFs, depending on who you are. Although I've done some of that. But even at my basic level, over and over again, running into John Howard Yoder as a writer, he's brilliant. I know multiple people that I've gotten to know like a decade ago on Facebook that discovered John Howard Yoder. I remember one friend, he put on his Facebook page. He was a Southern Baptist pastor, I think in Louisiana, and he posted his Facebook banner, JHY is my homeboy. And like so many people have discovered some of these truths through his writing. And now we have Bruxy Cavey. Yeah. And so many people have found his winsome approach to a Jesus-centered ethic of loving your enemies to be so impactful. Why do all of our celebrities have to have, I could say feet of clay, but that really feels like I'm soft pedaling the issue.
Right.
Why do they have to be such perverted creeps?
Right. Yeah.
That's a question. It's not rhetorical. It sounds rhetorical because I'm yelling, but I actually why can't we have any good celebrities? Rebekah, answer my question.
I'm glad she drew the short straw on that one.
But it's not just, don't just think it happens only in celebrity contexts. It happens a lot with local congregations, with leadership of missions organizations. It is something that is a problem, and that I think Christians with conviction in nonviolence should be willing to not even just to say we're going to do this because we're going to be an example to everybody, because I think a little past that point already, but really take our convictions really seriously. And I think that we can't just dig into the idea of nonviolence, but also to look at you have to look at the issue of power, I think, quite seriously. Because rejection of magistracy and, rejection of the sword are comments on what power is. The original word for nonviolence, can't pronounce it very well, Gewaltlosigkeit, I think, is the beginning part of that word. Gewalt is the word that many, for example, the reformers used to refer positively to authority and top-down power. Just like in the world, we have to have it in the church and we have to have it in the home. That was Luther's 3 estates. And the Anabaptists called nonviolence forcelessness, or almost like powerlessness. Though there are different angles on that word, but I think that aspect of it has kind of been lost. It's just saying we don't do that, but it's not saying we don't assume this kind of power over people, because they saw it magistrates didn't necessarily have to kill anybody or go to war, but they saw just the position itself, and taking that kind of power in society and over people as something to seriously consider, a different approach on as part of a nonviolent witness. And then very consistently throughout the pacifist side of early Anabaptist thought, not the other side, but consistently they were critical of the abuse of power such as by the clergy of the day, such as by the Reformation of the day, who kind of saw it as like government in the world, the church must be really, really governed. And they saw a widespread clergy abuse, from all the traditions they were dealing with. not to throw people under a bus.
Yeah.
But then they tried to take a really strong stand on that, so much so that sometimes it seems like they went a little bit the other way. And then there was a comment that I made earlier about like Pilgrim Marpeck felt that some of the congregations in Appenzell were a little bit too far in disciplining their leaders. They were taking it so seriously and wanting to prevent congregational abuse and control that they were a little bit harsh on even good shepherds.
Do you know what that looked like?
I am not exactly sure, but I know that they would ban the congregation would ban the leaders or put them under rebuke for like swearing oaths or.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and even Dru, I don't know what your experiences have been in sort of Anabaptist or Anabaptist adjacent congregations, but even the practice of sort of examination before communion, that has, I think at least in North America, sort of mutated into a time when the leaders of the congregation dictate to the individual congregants whether or not they believe they are worthy of communion. But the actual practice, the initial earliest practice around that actually served to empower the entire congregation, right? Where it transformed from the priest, the Catholic priest being the only one who could determine whether or not the Mass would be conducted, to now the entire congregation had a voice. And any individual within the congregation could speak up in that moment and say, no, we do not have peace with God and our fellow humans, and we as an entire body cannot take communion. And so the way that has transformed from a very, I hesitate to even call it democratic. It was more radical than democracy because it wasn't even majority rule. It was individual conscience, right? But that has transformed now into a prime example of the exercise of heavy-handed top-down power.
So listening to you and Rebekah both, and it's really interesting. As a pastor, having worked with a lot of really problematic situations, you said it's not democracy. It's something more than that. And my mind's like, oh, it's anarchy.
Yes.
And you have people
Don't say it like it's a bad thing. It's a good thing.
Okay, so sell me on anarchy.
Yeah, it's against
in the
authority,
church.
Right? It's the no archies, right? Anarchy, without archies, without rulers, powers, authorities, and the biblical witness is complex on this question, right? You have texts in the Bible that emphasize the importance, the centrality, the need for strong leadership, whether that's in civil society, particularly in the Old Testament, or in the church in the New Testament. And you have an awful lot of verses that are deeply cynical about and skeptical of the practice of authority, right? And so both of these streams coexist in the scriptural witness. And so I think part of our calling as followers of Jesus is to live in that tension carefully and to acknowledge there is no one approach that's always going to be perfect, right? Like even thinking about clergy abuse and the necessity or the value of having external structures, right? Oh, if we just get the external structures strong enough, then we won't have any more clergy abuse. Well, I think maybe the Catholic Church would beg to differ, right? Like there is no more hierarchical, top-down command and control tradition on the planet, and it was rampant with abuse. And so there's not going to be perfection, but I think the biblical witness invites us to live in the tension. And when we find ourselves gravitating toward exercising a heavier hand of authority, to inquire why, what is this about me? What's going on inside of me that's responding in this way? And when we find ourselves chafing against others exercising authority over us, to ask that same question. Why? What is it that's bothering me about this? Why can't I yield to this? Why can't I be in mutual submission with this? So there's always going to be that push-pull, that tension.
So the moderator-elect of the MCUSA conference believes that we should move all churches toward anarchy.
Yes, that's a very direct, exact quote of what I said, Drew. I really appreciate that very fair and accurate and honest summary of what I said. Yeah. And I do have people say who are like, oh, well, you're a hypocrite because you exercise a position of leadership while being skeptical about the idea of leadership. And fair. I accept that critique. But I hope that my exercise of leadership, to the extent I exercise leadership, is primarily about convening, is about bringing people together, drawing people to the table, engaging people in dialogue, and not simply me dictating this is what you must do.
Okay. That seems really hard.
It is.
Like, Rebekah, you had said in our conversation before this on WhatsApp, you said, I want to talk about how nonviolence should be defined as refusing power over others. And you touched on that with your historical examples. And I really appreciated that. I should say you did more than touch on it, but just to kind of distill it down, nonviolence should be defined as refusing power over others. When someone's asking you to take authority in the church, like when the congregation says, and this was my experience when I was ordained, please step up and take authority in this church. I don't want to be like Saul, hiding among this stuff when Samuel's calling him. But even as I bring up Saul, I'm thinking about how that ended up for him.
Yeah, badly.
Spoiler alert.
Yeah. So I think the German words really help here. No, I'm kidding.
Always.
The Greek words now. Well, okay. So actually, the Calvinist, the Reformed Belgic Confession of 1561, and Luther himself referred to Anabaptists as anarchists. It was a very common accusation thrown because they did not have the same structures, and therefore to them, they didn't have structures. But they did have structures, and it was structures of congregational accountability, of congregational discernment, of reading the scriptures together, of having what they call the rule of Paul, where someone would preach and the rest will actually critique, or as Paul said, judge. And
you're talking about 1 Corinthians 14, right?
That was actually, I think, a strong accountability within congregations, just a different form of it. And the word anarchy really, it just says without archies, which is the top-down power, but it doesn't say, without any form of order, without any kind of neutrality, or it's not to say, it's just without dictatorship, to use the word. That in Greek, in the New Testament, there are strong words used of governmental power, exousia, to exercise authority. There's the word archon, which refers to secular powers. Those are, I did a detailed study of the use of these words, and I find that there's secular power in a certain way in the New Testament, which is like Jesus saying, do not lord it over, do not exercise power over one another. All of you are brothers, don't call anyone father, don't call anyone instructor. There's, and verses saying you do not need anyone to teach you. The Holy Spirit isn't of you. There is an order to that, the Holy Spirit being in each person. But the word that comes up the most about leadership in the New Testament is shepherding, being an example, caring, managing. It's different. We think they're all authority, they're all power and archy. In English we tend to conflate the two, and I think some traditions like Luther's tradition really saw all of these as being the same. And so in our minds, if you don't have this archon or exousia, that you don't have any order or any authority or leadership. I think leadership maybe is a better word at all, which in my opinion isn't true. We are called to embody this upside down kingdom, so it is a challenge, and we may not know exactly what that means. We have lots of ideas of it from the New Testament, where Paul says, I don't lord it over you in your faith, I just, or he says to Philemon, I choose to appeal to you as a brother, even though he's an apostle.
Oh, that's a great example.
I think there's a special calling to be the upside down kingdom in our church relationships.
Yeah, well said. So Jon, do you have any just personal thoughts, insights, lessons you've learned, both in your role as pastor and now as and I know I've given you a hard time about this Moderator-Elect title. I think it's really awesome. And
Yeah.
And so please take my teasing as mere teasing. But do you have any like practical lessons you've learned as a pastor, as a leader, for how to maintain that upside down ethic of leadership that Rebekah's laid out for us?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Not me. I didn't lay it out. I hope the Bible laid it out.
The Bible laid it out. She just gave us the Bible study here. Which are you allowed to sit under a woman's biblical teaching, Dru, or is that verboten?
Answer the question, Mr. Carlson.
I'm not teaching.
So I will say there's I think language matters, as I think Rebekah was noting. There are different ways we can talk about authority, power. There are complexities going from Greek to Latin, going from German to English, and so it's worth having these conversations, even if they can feel like they get a little bit pedantic at times. It's worth thinking through what exactly do we mean when we talk about these things. And I think even the term moderator, it seems like maybe a silly kind of a term, but I think there's something valuable in it that says the role of this is it's not necessarily the leader, it's not the governor, it's not the controller, it's not the boss, it's someone who moderates. And you can interpret that different ways, right? Is this someone who brings a moderating presence to our sort of passions and excesses, or is this someone who is there to allow for the free and fair exchange of ideas among people, to call people together in a spirit of listening to one another, listening for the voice of God in our midst, and to moderate that conversation. As far as practicality, I think one of the things that we see in Anabaptism, and part of why you end up with streams of Anabaptism that do have autocratic forms of leadership, is the reality of hardship, the reality of adversity. For early Anabaptists, it was persecution, right? In my own lifetime, two examples I think of one colleague who unfortunately discovered that two congregants were having an affair. And in talking with him about it, he said, I never felt more like the Pope ever before in my ministry. No one in the congregation knew what to do. No one knew how to respond. And I needed to take decisive action to try to limit the damage, the fallout from this. In my own personal ministry, it's probably been COVID. I have functioned at times way more autocratically within my own congregation than I would like to. Or than what I would think is healthy, but it felt a necessary response to this sort of exigent situation, right? Like there were really hard decisions that had to be made in a short span of time. There wasn't time to bring the whole congregation together for conversation and discernment. So those are kind of negative examples. I don't know that they're real positive. But I would say a lot of it starts with, and I think this does tie into questions of clergy misconduct and abuse. A lot of it starts with sort of your own self-definition, right? Who you are, how you understand yourself. I think I even heard you, Dru, saying like when you were ordained, what I heard you saying was kind of internalized an expectation of this congregation, fix us, like make us better, make us whole. And I can't do that, right? Mm-hmm. And you're probably a better pastor than I am, but my hunch would be that you can't do that either. And so our own internal self-definition has to start from a place of recognizing this is Christ's church. Christ is the one who is building this church. Christ ultimately is the one who is shepherding these people's souls. At best, I can function as an under-shepherd. And so the actual authority that has been delegated to me is relatively small. And the more we can acknowledge that and grow in our own comfort of that and understand that God's love for us, affection toward us, does not at all in any way, shape, or form hinge on our capacity to compel good moral behavior from other people, right? Like the more we can just like let go of those expectations that sometimes people tend to put on us, the healthier we can be as leaders. And I would even use that language within the church, leading not in the sense of telling others what to do, but leading in working to continually try to model as best we can a healthy inner spirituality that manifests itself in not needing to control those around us.
And once again, I hear you, John, saying kind of what Rebekah's thesis was here. And again, I think deriving from scripture that part of what our call to non-resistance is to reject the authority, the power that people are even asking us to take up some time, that people are telling us to take up some time. Insert your favorite Tolkien reference here. but that idea of having this power that you could use for good and people are asking you to and saying, I can't. It reminds me of, so I'm in the middle of my grad program, actually going down this weekend for my first in-person session. So that'll be cool. But over and over again with us, this cohort of us who have all, studied as undergrads and being told, everything needs to be in MLA or APA format. It needs to be a minimum of 5,000 words and it needs to be on my desk by this date or you'll get an F. And so over and over again, my facilitators, that's what they call themselves. Like, we're not professors, we're facilitators. People, my cohort, they're asking, so how long do you want this response to be? How long do you want this, this active research plan to be? How many words are you looking for? What format? And they're like, this isn't for me, it's for you. And no matter how many times people ask, they refuse to give a word count because it's like, it's not about pleasing us or getting a grade. It's about developing who you are as a teacher and developing your capacity to serve well in the classroom. But isn't that? I would say that. I mean, isn't that some of what you're saying as far as using the term moderator? And my instructors, professors call us your facilitators, and that's kind of what you're getting at. Yeah.
Yeah, and the goal of the Christian life, and I think N.T. Wright gets at this a little bit, although he would come from a tradition with a much stronger sense of authority and hierarchy. But even he says, in his sort of studies of Pauline theology, Paul's goal is to participate in the fashioning of mature Christians. It is not that they will always look at Paul and say, tell me what to do, O wise master. But that they will be able to commune with God and understand the will of Christ for themselves in their community. Now, there are times, again, these sort of exigent emergency situations where Paul throws up these really solid roadblocks and says, don't do this, because he recognizes the devastating consequences that can come from that. But by and large, it is about the shaping, the forming of character within the Christian and within the entire community, so that the leader progressively becomes less and less necessary.
Yeah. Well, so that Jesus as leader becomes progressively more and more central.
Although note that Jesus' leadership strategy was to hang out for 3 years and then disappear. So I sometimes think we can be a little bit too quick to assume that, well, if the human leader gets out of the way, then Jesus will exercise that sort of directive, controlling function in our lives. And I'm not convinced that's how Jesus exercises authority either.
Yeah, 100% agreement with that. I was actually thinking of I don't need to, well, even my own children, as they grow in Jesus, I don't need to shepherd them toward love your neighbor as yourself as much, because they have the Sermon on the Mount. And again, love to have Titus in on some of this conversation. I kind of reject the model that Jesus is telling us what to do, buy this car, don't buy that car, go here for the weekend, eat this for lunch, don't eat that.
Sure.
I reject that approach for the most part. There are always exceptions, but I do feel that as I model going to Jesus so woefully imperfectly at times, as I model going to Jesus and other people see me doing that, they're going to do the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
I kind of find that you use negative examples because I think that's really scriptural and consistent, that Paul pulls out his apostle card when there is a genuine threat to, the shepherd pulls out the staff and the rod, not for the sheep, but for wolves, or when there's something that is a genuine threat and a genuine issue that you do need a leader to be keep that heresy away or keep that, predator away. he pulls it out when it is more of a negative, like a card, the apostle card he pulls out, not so much on a normative basis. On a normative basis, he only wants to be a fellow laborer, a bond servant,
sure.
that type of thing. The language that I think Paul uses is really, really insightful.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That's another great point. And we see that in the situation in Canada with is it Be in Christ now? They kind of switched from Brethren in Christ and Bruxy KV's church conference there, where they did pull out the big guns and they said, again, I don't remember quite the timeline, but there was the recommendation and he stepped down because things were bad. There was a genuine problem. And I want to be clear that I trust that a lot of our audience and myself are praying for that situation. I'm praying that God brings redemption and brings further life to the meeting place and to that and continued restoration for Bruxy KV. I want to throw one more thing out, specifically about the sexual abuse from pastors to congregants. So often, and I know of a specific situation in a conservative Mennonite church too, is so often when something comes out like this, the pastor, whether a big celebrity like KV or a minor celebrity like the situation I'm thinking of, they're like, it was consensual. I was tempted. I fell. I'm a weak man. I'm sorry. KV at least did say, he said, I did abuse power. But there was kind of this disconnect. Again, I really want to hesitate to say I know what's happening and I can make a judgment call. Based on what I see, it felt like there was a disconnect between what the report was saying, what it appeared from the victim, and KV acknowledging that he had failed sexually. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that if you're in a position of authority, of meaningful authority, if you're a celebrity and you have a congregant, a patient, a fan that you're having a sexual relationship with, it's almost always going to be sexual abuse as well. I would say this about, the former President Clinton and his dalliances in the office with interns. And I would say this about Bruxy KV with the affair with a 20-something-year-old. And again, I feel icky talking about it because these are real people, right? But I just want to underline, and you guys can push back, that if you're in a position of authority or power, and you have somebody that's under that authority or power, or they're in awe of your celebrity, you have power. And any engagement sexually with that person is a form of coercive sexual abuse. It's not just, quote unquote, merely immorality. It's not just, quote unquote, merely sexual failing. It's abuse. Is that overstated, Pastor Jon?
No, not at all. I mean, at least in my tradition, and this is one of those things where I'm pretty comfortable saying that my tradition has finally started to figure this out and is close to getting this right. And many other Christian traditions are as well. The sort of generally accepted principle right now is that clergy and congregants, outside of a pre-existing marriage relationship, clergy and congregants cannot have consensual sexual relationships. There's always an abuse of power involved. Similar, but with some distinctions, but similar to how we would speak about psychotherapists and their clients, about doctors and their patients, a growing awareness about, again, to go to Rebekah's favorite space, academia, professors and students, adults and minors. There is an inherent power imbalance. Now, I realize this is weird after all this talk of Rebekah and I saying, well, the real job of clergy is to unburden ourselves of power and not take up power. So maybe once we do that, then it's all okay. Then we won't have any power to abuse anymore. That's not the reality. That's not how this works. If people are looking to us to provide spiritual insight, counsel, wisdom, as much as we are doing the internal work of trying to not hold on to power that is not ours, people are giving power over to us. I think it was Dan Allender at the Allender Center in Seattle, who does a lot of really insightful work on the intersection of sort of therapeutic approaches and faith, talks about the power of a pastor. That it's not that God has given us power, but that individuals often will relinquish power over their own lives or attempt to relinquish power over their own lives to people they see as spiritual authorities. And so we have to take that responsibility incredibly seriously. And it means that any sexual contact between clergy and those in our care is abusive by definition.
And it can also go beyond sexual abuse. And this is where I'm asking myself, I mean, even as a dad, to be honest, but in my role as a leader in the church and walking with brothers and sisters, I think it's an important question to just ask, what power do I have and what power do people think I have? Because it's easy for us to adopt a posture of faux humility and be like, oh no, I'm just serving the Lord, just doing my thing, just studying to prepare my sermon. But I'm denying the fact that there is a power dynamic there. There is something going on. And so I have to stop and ask myself, whatever I do with it, I have to walk in a humble awareness that I do have power over people. And I've got to be honest about that. I've got to be honest with the complications that creates. And, as Rebekah's been emphasizing, surrender that as possible, except when Jesus calls me to step up. And that, I love how Paul puts that tension there in Romans 12. And I think I've mentioned this before, but he emphasizes, like, let each person think soberly about the grace of God that's been given to them, not more highly than you ought to think, but do think about it.
Yeah.
I think the other word for power, the Holy Spirit type power, you shall receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you. That is the spiritual power is different from top-down authority. It's dunamis. And that is where the functions and gifts of the Spirit in the church come from. And it comes from the Holy Spirit, the gifting, or Christ himself gave some to be apostles, some prophets, and all that. And to abuse that is a violation of the Holy Spirit and of the gifts given to the congregation for edification and accountability and all that. So you don't even have to say it's because pastors innately have power over. It's because they have a responsibility, a gifting from the Holy Spirit, that kind of spiritual power. And that's and then of course, like James says, those who teach, who exercise that office, are in danger of stricter judgment and all that. I would agree with what Dru is saying, that God created sexual relationships to be like in the Garden of Eden. But in society, like in Mesopotamian society, in Greco-Roman society, they made it hugely about one person having power over another person. And that is a very fallen and broken system that I think Paul specifically goes against in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, where he says one has authority over the other and the other, because in Greco-Roman society, it was not like that. It was the exact opposite, where one party had total power and total control over another. And that's how all sexual relationships were defined, whether it's like from a slaver to the person, or even children, men, women, they're enslaving, or whether it's like a conquering army, the Assyrians, performing sexual assault on the people that they colonize and conquer, the Roman army. There was a huge power element to it. And I would say very strongly that sexual relationships or sexual activity outside of the paradigm that God set in Eden is under the paradigm of the world, which is of
our case.
That's non-consensual and that's coercive.
Yeah. Great point there.
Maybe very, very strongly stated.
Yeah, and I would say, Dru, the sort of awareness of the functioning of power in interpersonal relationships and in social dynamics is very much at the leading edge of a lot of conversations in Mennonite Church USA right now and within our congregations, and thinking about gender dynamics and the power that exists there, because there is this tendency, or has been this tendency, for people to say, well, we're just the quiet in the land. Nobody here really has power. But when you actually observe the functioning of the social system, there's an awful lot of power going on.
Yeah.
And And denying the reality of that actually makes that power more potentially toxic and more potentially destructive.
Yeah, the velvet glove can be just as crushing as the iron fist or glove or whatever.
That's similar to the issue of like racism, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Where it's easy to become blind to the kind of privilege or power just because, we're not involved with those systems, the quiet ones in the land.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Rebekah, have you read Liberating the Politics of Jesus at all, or any of the chapters in it?
Yeah, I'm in the midst of reviewing it. It's good stuff.
Yeah. There's just some really excellent stuff in there from primarily female Mennonite scholars, sort of grappling with somewhat Yoder's legacy, but also thinking about how to center some of the things, Rebekah, you noted have been not given the attention that they deserve, but how to center some things that have been sort of written off as domestic or women's issues, but recognizing, no, this is actually the core of what it means to be a peace-loving follower of Jesus, to take these questions seriously. And also would highly, highly recommend a book, not by a Mennonite, unfortunately, but maybe we'll get her there one of these days. Diane Langberg, who wrote Redeeming Power, Understanding Authority and Abuse in the Church. She has some really insightful things to say in that.
What was the author of the first book you mentioned there, John?
It's actually an edited compilation.
Sure.
The editors are, it's an academic book. Sorry, Dru. If you're in the middle of grad school, you might not want to add this on. But Elizabeth Soto Albrecht, who's a wonderful woman and a friend of mine, and Daryl Stevens were the editors of that, and has contributions from like Lydia Neufeld-Harder and Linda Gaiman Peachy, Regina Shan-Stoltzfus, a number of really, really solid scholars and theologians.
Awesome. We've spent a lot of time talking about the ickiness of some of the religious traditions we've come from, and I just wondered, John, because you're not originally from an Anabaptist background.
Yeah.
Can you wrap up by just telling us maybe one thing that attracted you, or one story that showed how you were drawn to the Anabaptist tradition? Just kind of wash our ears out a little bit with that.
Yeah. So, my sort of family of origin and history are a bit more complicated than we have time to get into right now, and questions of abuse feature very heavily in those. I actually spent about 5 years of my life in the foster care system because my parents were unable to provide a safe environment for myself and my siblings. But in the midst of that came into, my parents were pretty active in like fundamentalist evangelical kinds of traditions, and that's where I sort of landed as a teenager. And my teenage years, so I would have graduated high school in the early 2000s, and this sort of obviously coincided with the attacks on September 11th. And being in an evangelical church, an evangelical American church, while the United States was declaring war in other parts of the world, and listening to the rhetoric and the spiritualized rhetoric that sought to provide a sort of veneer of religious acceptability to what was happening, what was really brutal violence being unleashed by the United States military, first in Afghanistan and then in Iraq, and listening to people who claimed to follow Jesus celebrate this was really disconcerting for me and really troubling. And around that same time, I had gotten to know a couple folks in a local Mennonite youth group, and through that experience discovered within Anabaptism, and I did not know the problematic history of John Howard Yoder, I didn't know any of this yet, but what I knew was here is a faith tradition and a faith community that takes seriously the teachings of Jesus and seeks to live them out, even when it is costly, even when it is unpopular, even when it means that we don't take the retributive violence that everyone seems to want us to take, even when it means that we try to find ways to love those who have harmed us. We do this because we believe that's what God has done for us in Christ. And so finding that tradition was, I sometimes say, if I hadn't found the Mennonite church, I'm not sure I could still be a Christian today. And so there's something about the integrity of the Anabaptist witness to God's peace that has held me or tethered me in a really healthy way to the Christian tradition.
Yeah, well, thanks for that. Titus, this is what everybody's saying. Go join the Mennonite church. So, no, I really appreciate that. That's a great testimony. And And thanks for everybody for listening. This has been a little bit more of a sobering conversation, despite my sniping at Jon here. It's some heavy stuff, but I think it's really worth hearing. And I appreciate having super articulate people like Rebekah and Jon on. So thanks for listening. Go check out our our umbrella organization there over at the Kingdom Outpost, right, Rebekah? And
church, nah.
And we will see you next time.